advertised, this is actually a brown bag lunch, so I'm glad to see that at least half the room have lunches, and for those that do not, I hope you indulge us in us munching while we listen to Robert speak. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to co-host with UNDP Independent Development Analyst, Ethan here, on this brown bag lunch. And as our guest speaker is Robert Kirkpatrick, good to see you, Rob, who is director of the UN Global Pulse, an initiative of the Secretary General which harnesses big data and real-time analytics for global development and crisis resilience. He's also going to talk on a bit, I think, on the publication, which is of great interest to all of us who are in evaluation, which is integrating big data into the monitoring and evaluation of development programs, and how to integrate big data in program monitoring and evaluation. I have to confess, I haven't read the book. I took the time to read the executive summary yesterday, and I noted that most of the applications of big data in international development do not currently focus directly on monitoring, and even less on evaluation. So it seems like we're at least at the cusp of hopefully something. I don't know if Robert might remember, but 4 years ago, 2013, we at OIOS-IED actually approached Global Pulse on the possibility of conducting, for lack of a better term, a utility assessment of the analytical and publication products of the regional commissions. And I don't know if that was the first time that Global Pulse had the opportunity to use the approach for evaluation purposes. If it is, then maybe we have a first there for us. But that would be just vanity, because aside from that, in terms of the utility of that assessment, I have to confess, we looked at the data, we provided information on Twitter followers and Facebook followers of the regional commissions and related banks, and we presented data. It looked good, it had a nice table, but to be honest then, and perhaps less so now, we didn't quite know what to make of that data. We reported it, and what did it mean that ECA had 18,888 followers and all, and so on. I think the appreciation and understanding of big data must have, as it does in the IT sector, grown tremendously since then. And more recently, the big data is in the news, not least for its impact on the recent elections. There was a fascinating article about that, if you haven't seen it, the influence of big data on the elections. I think the evaluation community has a lot of catch up to do to try to make use of the information, the opportunity of this information as it currently exists. With that, I'll hand over, and Andrew wants to say something.
No, thank you very much, Eddie, and it's an honor to also co-host this event with you. Just going back a few months ago, we had our evaluation advisory panel member, Michael Bamberger, talk to us on big data. And he definitely got us all very curious. And we remain curious because the key challenge is, does the availability of large sums of data convert into a dimension of transparency, accountability, and true performance reporting? So we are very interested in terms of what you say. I also sit here wearing the other cap as UNEC Vice Chair responsible for the Sustainable Development Goals, and obviously that's huge data, and we want to know a little more in terms of what this means in practice. But we are very honored to have you, Robert, here, to share your expertise and experience and to take the conversation forward.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you. So, the answer to the question, does it translate, is not without your help. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in thinking about this and mapping out a way forward. We think with this new report, which I hope many of you have had a chance to look at least in the executive summary, it's very sizable in its totality. We think there are tremendous opportunities. It doesn't mean that this is any sort of panacea, and it will take years to really operationalize this at scale, but there are opportunities to get started immediately. So what I'd like to do is give you an overview of sort of what big data is in the context of the data revolution, which is something people have been talking about for some time now, how we see the data revolution within Global Pulse, and what we think it means for development practice and for evaluation. And then I want to show you some real-world examples of the kinds of projects we've been doing with UN system partners and national institutions around the world, so that you can get a real feel for this. As you don't know, we're an initiative that was launched by the SG in 2009. Global Pulse is uniquely the UN's only response to the only request they've ever received from the G20. And this came at the height of the financial crisis, when everyone was realizing that we were living in a hyper-connected world in which price shocks and social upheaval and political unrest could spread at the speed of electrons around the world. And yet, we were still assuming that development was this slow and linear process that couldn't be reversed, and it was okay just to use 3-year-old data to make a 5-year plan and then take a snapshot every couple of years to check that things are on track. And there was this recognition, actually we need real-time awareness of what's happening at the household level. So that was where the project came from. There's a lot of technology, there's a lot of new data out there. How can we make sure that we take advantage of this for at least real-time awareness and preferably prediction? Our vision is a world in which big data is harnessed for the public good. You can tell from the name Global Pulse, the concept is really about measuring human well-being in real time, understanding what's happening as it's happening, not after the fact. And the way we function is that of an accelerator. How can we make this happen faster and, where possible, head in the right direction? Let's see if I can get there. So, what do we do? We have sort of 3 distinct roles in our strategy to make this happen. One is we're in the Data Innovation Lab. So UN system partners, national institutions come to us and say, can you help us figure out a better way to do this? Richer information, faster information, reduced cost, and so forth. And we bring together partners from academia, private sector, technology companies and different kinds of companies with data and analytical expertise and tools to do projects. And it's a pretty classic innovation process, going from initial findings to a methodology to a prototype, an application that someone can actually look at to try to make a better decision, and work with them to pilot it and get it ready to scale. We also do a lot of work on the policy side, particularly within the UN system. We're now weeks away through the UNDG Data and Transparency Working Group for having a system-wide or UNDG-wide set of data privacy principles. And with OICT, we co-chair the UN Data Policy Working Group, so we're looking to actually have data privacy policy system-wide. Because big data is different. It has tremendous risks that come with it, beyond those of more traditional data. And finally, we engage publicly in a number of ways, for example, with companies, to find ways to help them unlock the social value of their data. We operate a network of 3 labs in New York, Uganda, and Indonesia. And you can see not typical traditional UN spaces. They're really places for experimentation, trying new things, and failing fast, and so forth. So let's look at some data. What you see here is a map of the city of Jakarta, where we have one of our labs. This looks like a roadmap. It was actually produced by Tweets. And the point here is to say, if you've been in Jakarta traffic, you know how that looks like a roadmap. But the point is that there's so many people on Twitter in Indonesia. By some estimates, Jakarta is actually the tweetingest city in the world at about 9 million per day. When you filter out the chatter about celebrities and sports scores and new products, what you find is people talking about the affordability of food, why they don't intend to vaccinate their children. Lots of relevant signal there. Here you see a visualization of, this is actually Jakarta, this large cluster, and north is to the right. This is, it's about 5 o'clock in the morning, and that's 12 million people commuting to work. This is produced by an anonymous data set generated from a mobile phone carrier in Indonesia. Every time you make or receive a call, send or receive a text message, the tower, its location, is stored for both the sender and the receiver. And that means that every mobile operator on Earth is actually running a network that can produce real-time maps of the flow of the population in and out of a city, between cities, between countries. And they're barely even using this for business purposes. But you can begin to ask questions like, how far do women have to go to get to a clinic? Or how have people been displaced new opportunities. On a more fine scale, this is Kampala, where we have our other lab, and in Kampala, we partner with a company that makes anti-theft devices for bodabodas. It's a little GPS chip and a little phone chip, and you hide it somewhere in your motorbike, and turns out when you take that data set, again, anonymized, you can actually see every traffic jam in Kampala, which means that you can begin to then simulate the impact of, for example, changes to the transportation system. Here, you have a visualization created by the Spanish bank, BBVA, who's one of our partners. This is of credit card transactions, anonymized and aggregated in Spain over Easter weekend in 2011. And the transactions are broken down. So blue is groceries, yellow is gas stations, pink is fashion, and red is alcohol. So at night, it gets very red. And they don't even eat dinner until like 11 in Spain. But the point is that every financial institution in the world can essentially see in real time where people have money and where they don't, what they choose to spend it on, how much money they spend, whether or not they can repay their debts. This is a real-time sensor for the economic health and well-being of communities, and yet that data is not being used, except maybe government gets a snapshot once a year of sort of average credit card balances, but this is real-time information. So this is this founding hypothesis of Pulse. The digital services can function as sensor networks for human well-being. People search on the internet, they move through cities, they buy and sell goods, they share their lives on social networks, and they do so in many ways to meet their basic needs. And when their needs change, they change what they search for, they change how they move, they change what they buy and sell in ways that we can learn to recognize the signature of when people lose their jobs, when they get sick, when they're struggling to afford basic necessities. So there's this massive volume of data out there today. It's passing through our bodies right now. Right? By some estimates, there's more data created in 2016 alone than in all of the rest of human history combined. The rate of data production is doubling, more than doubling every year. It's not just how big it is, it's how much bigger it's getting, how quickly. So we think of this as a kind of new natural resource. It's increasingly ubiquitous, it's abundant, it's infinitely renewable, you can't use it up. But it's fallen prey to an extractive industry. Data mining. Its benefits aren't reaching those who need them most. The skills and technology and resources necessary to extract insights from it are in the hands of 1%. And although it's infinitely renewable, it also bears some affinity to nuclear energy. In its raw form, when this stuff is generated, it becomes mixed with your and my personal information. So it tends to leak, contaminate. In its raw form, it's harmful to human life. And so we're facing a moment, I think, like the global community in the 1950s, having seen the horrors of nuclear war and asking, okay, well, we could use this to power cities for thousands of years. But what's the science we need to understand the risks and mitigate them? What's the engineering we need to contain it safely and extract value from it? And how do we govern this stuff? How do we trace it from generation to disposal and make sure that it's used responsibly? So, as I say, plutonium in its raw form. Hearing more stories of just how dangerous this stuff is. So in 2013, the high-level panel for the post-2015 framework issued this call for a data revolution. And everybody started talking about, okay, a data revolution, but we need a data revolution. Others were saying, well, no, we don't. There's already a data revolution underway in the world. Right? We don't need a data revolution. We need to harness the data revolution that's already transforming society. What does a data revolution look like? We've seen it before. Right? The point of a data revolution is that it makes what used to be invisible visible. Medical imaging, the invention of X-rays, data revolution. Right? Made it possible to diagnose disease, to see injury, to understand the human body in ways never possible before. And that was incredibly disruptive. Right? Whole industries disappeared, new industries emerged, new technologies, new practices, new skills were required. Not everybody made the journey. Genetics, same thing. Now we can see disease risk. We can see it and we can predict it. That's a data revolution. We can see inside programming, in a sense, of the human body. So when we talk about big data versus traditional approaches like surveys, this is a data revolution. And it's sort of like photography versus video. We've been for decades and decades going to these living dynamic communities and saying, let's try to understand what's happening here. And we take a static snapshot and we walk away. What's interesting about big data is that it allows you to observe the behavior of individuals and communities and those dynamics and watch them unfold over time. Now, video does not replace photography, nor will big data replace surveys. We think of the survey as sort of an ultra-high resolution color image where you go in and really find out what's happening and why and get at causality in a way that no other technique can. But big data allows you to look at patterns, detect anomalies, understand where risks are emerging, and in particular, feed that real-time information into predictive models to understand where you need to take action to prevent getting wrong. So, remember the good old days of the MDGs? Life was simple from a datascape standpoint. Government produced data, collected data, was in control and moved the data, and was the one using the data. I think that's the world of official statistics. Now we go here. Data is produced by people automatically, often without their knowledge, collected in real time by machines. It's owned by corporations, and yet it's public sector institutions that need it to achieve the SDGs. So this is an incredibly fragmented landscape. And we believe more than 90% of the data that's going to be needed to achieve the SDGs falls into this category. But there are arguably three different revolutions out there. This isn't one. I mean, the one that everybody started talking about back in 2013 was how we need to finish the 150-year-old unfinished revolution of official statistics. Right? There are countries out there that don't even know their GDP or their population. True. Can big data be used in some cases to generate indicators like SDG indicators? Absolutely. That's an opportunity. But I would argue that imagine that we produce flawless indicators for every single human being alive in the world. We're still only then allowing as institutions ourselves to implement better versions of the same linear outmoded processes that we're relying on today. If you look at what big data has done to the private sector, it's absolutely transformed accountability, and it's absolutely transformed how we operate. Companies now have real-time feedback on what's happening in their own manufacturing, in their markets, whether or not their customers like their products. You think about Adidas launches a new running shoe in Europe at 9 o'clock in the morning, and at 9:05, they can already tell where it's selling faster, and they're redirecting trucks on the road to those locations. That kind of agile, adaptive approach to programming is something that we need to be able to master. So we see yes, there's a measurement revolution, but there's also an accountability revolution. Sure, the open data movement empowers citizens, but how actionable is 3-year-old statistical data produced by the previous administration versus being able to see in 3 hours that an ethnic minority following a disaster is not receiving the same level of assistance? It's accountability. The real-time nature of this stuff has a power of transparency that none else does. And finally, to say the management revolution, more agile, more efficient, smarter ways of working. In a complex world, we think of this as kind of like moving from this linear model and shooting an arrow at a target and assuming that, unless the wind blows, you're not going to hit your target, right? This is the world of the log frame. Get the best data you can, make the best plan that you can, faithfully execute your plan, and you're guaranteed to achieve your outcomes, right? Maybe not, because the world changes so fast these days. Sometimes just being able to navigate in the present would be of great value. So when we look at the data that's out there, we tend to work with sort of data that falls into one of these two broad categories, what people say or what they do. Think of this first category, news, social media, advertising, radio, television. This is information that's more or less open. It doesn't fit in your Excel spreadsheet necessarily, but it's openly available, sometimes free, sometimes you have to buy it. Fewer privacy concerns there. When we talk about the behavioral information, this is where things get very exciting and very dangerous all at the same time. How people move, what they buy and sell, what they search for.
send, how they use postal system, for example, how they communicate. This kind of information is very hard to anonymize. It's of great value to businesses. It could be, in the eyes of businesses, misused by governments to increase regulatory scrutiny on the businesses, so they hold this stuff close. And we've spent 7 years learning how to persuade them to make it available for use in the public good. So, just to kind of summarize different types of opportunities we see: better early warning systems, more up-to-date, rich information for planning, more effective management. This is something you're going to need to look at in the future. We can start by looking at, how can we go back and look at things that have already happened through the lens of these different kinds of data and use this as a tool for evaluation. But ultimately, just like evaluators, so long as it's not a conflict of interest, need to be at the table when the programs are being planned. Right? These kinds of information need to be used programmatically, so that one of the things you're evaluating is whether or not the organization doing the work actually used the data that was available and used it effectively. The excuse we didn't know that was happening is disappearing in person. So this is something we need to look at. And finally, of course, there's lots of information out there, and it's real time, which means you can get continuous information, not just on implementation, but on emerging risks that need to be addressed. So let's look at some real world stuff so you can get a feel for how this could work. SDG 1. So in Uganda, it turns out, we have looked at the official poverty statistics for Uganda and looked at how people were spending money at the same time on airtime, right? Scratch cards topping off their phones. We get a Pearson correlation of 0.88. Right? How you spend money on your phone predicts your overall consumption, right? Because we've seen in Rwanda, we did a study, we got a 0.89 correlation between food consumption among market-dependent households and the airtime, right? It's sort of food now versus food later. In Uganda, we've seen a study a few years ago that showed that there was a significant fraction of the population regularly giving up 1 meal a day to top off their airtime. Because that's your basic productivity tool. That's how you meet somebody if that's, next Tuesday at 10 o'clock on the street corner here for a transaction. So this is interesting. Not only is it very granular information, you can get down to the cell tower level of spatial resolution, but it's also time sensitive, as we're beginning to see now from more work that we're doing. When there's a drought, you see these drops very quickly. After a natural disaster, some communities recover faster than others. That was a project with WFP. Another project we did with WFP, this is in Indonesia. Indonesians, as I mentioned, tweet a lot. We got daily commodity prices for 20 commodities from 30 cities across the country. This is from the National Reporting System, and built a predictive model on Twitter. And it turns out we get correlations 0.87, 0.91 for different commodities. Turns out Indonesians have no reason to lie about what they're paying for chicken or fish on Twitter. That would be silly. So how do we trust these people? Did they have any reason to lie? Well, it turns out they don't, because you actually get quite reliable indices. And it's interesting. They work if the prices are high or rising, but as soon as the prices drop, the signal disappears. We call this complainonomics or windralytics. So no hedge fund, but possibly an interesting approach to food security modeling. Population movement generated from mobile phone data from Orange, a mobile operator in Uganda. So if you take, for example, working with the Ministry of Health there, you take current outbreak information for a disease like measles, and you combine that algorithmically with the mobility information of the population, and this is a disease that's spread by human contact, you can then actually model the risk of the spread of disease. Now, where we're looking next in Uganda is specifically around malaria. This country is the highest burden of malaria mortality and morbidity on Earth, and yet they do not have the resources to take a proactive approach to surveillance. So the idea here is to be able to give healthcare workers a map every week that says these 3 districts are those that have the highest risk of an outbreak next week. Here's where you need to spray, here's where you need to make sure people have bed nets, health authorities on alert, and so forth. Indonesians tweeting about why they don't intend to vaccinate their children. This is essentially like spotting rumors, fake news, as we're calling this stuff now. misinterpret stories. A baby died after a vaccine. Turns out that wasn't. A baby died of abuse, not a vaccine. But the rumor spreads, or people are saying, well, my local imam said that vaccine serum is made from pig's blood and it's not halal. Okay. This is about spotting the meme rather than a disease outbreak. UNAIDS during the World Cup asked us to partner with them and the Ministry of Health in Brazil, looking at Twitter from all 30 cities where games were being played. And the idea was to measure public awareness of the Defend the Goal campaign that UNAIDS was running and other related issues. Not a lot of conversation about the campaign, sadly. Lots of discrimination against people living with HIV. Okay. Turns out, just as we know, social media is great for promulgating hate speech, and it's great for measuring hate speech. We're doing a remarkable amount of this today, especially with the inclusion of Goal 16 in the new 2030 agenda. Lots of interest in this. Here is a system that we developed that went live about 2 weeks ago, hazegazer.org. This is running the president's office in Indonesia. This is a system that mines Twitter and YouTube and a number of different sources very soon, radio in Bahasa and Javanese language, looking at where people are reporting hotspots, fires, particularly in Sumatra, where they're reporting the impacts of haze, specifically where those are health impacts and where they're asking for government intervention. Okay, but all this stuff is digital, right? This is all produced by people running around with smartphones. So what do you do in the rest of the developing world, where most people don't have smartphones? So one of the areas we're most excited about is community radio, rural FM radio stations, talk radio, radio news. If we look at Uganda and you go outside of Kampala, there are about 200 FM radio stations. Out of Kampala, there are 50 in Kampala, but outside of Kampala, there are about 200. Sorry, there are 200. Every single one of them is in an area with at least 2.5G internet coverage, not 3G. Slow GPRS. But you can't run a radio station without a smartphone. And so we started asking, look, do they do have a social media platform in Uganda and across much of Africa, and it's radio. People can call in, those who have a basic $20 phone, or text in to a show for new mothers, a show for farmers and their crop diseases, a show on HIV or domestic violence, and what do you think, what's your opinion, what's happening in the community. So the idea is, well, let's use a 30-year-old technology, dictation software, to turn this stuff into text in near real time. But these are Ugandan languages. It's not like Microsoft or Google are going to come up with speech recognition for Uganda or Chile. We could do that. So we did. And we hired a 30-person speech, not 30-person, 10-person speech engineering team. And we have been working for the last year and a half, and we now have speech recognition for Ugandan English, Uganda, and Acholi. Acholi is particularly interesting because it's also spoken in parts of Kenya and South Sudan. And essentially what we're talking about is using this technology to monitor people's voices in these public conversations, where we detect conversation, because we can recognize and delete music. Where we detect actual conversation, we can then identify keywords indicating that this is a topic of interest. This is a conversation about education. This is a conversation about HIV. And then you can go in and do deeper analysis. From what we can tell, there are about 7.5 million words spoken every day on Ugandan radio stations. It's a lot of content. No one's ever measured that before, 9 times the number of words of Shakespeare. But you can filter it for just the conversations relevant to the SDGs. So you can see the basic process here and some of the languages that we have. So this is an example. The first version, when we got our Uganda recognition up to about 60% accuracy, that was kind of the first pass at it. That was good enough for us to start doing keyword spotting, not to produce a reliable transcript, but to say education was mentioned 11 times last night on the radio, and here's where those stations are. And then a human operator can then go in and click on each segment and listen to that 60-second segment. Right? So again, if part of what you're doing is trying to understand where the population knows a risk or where they don't, or to change people's perceptions of a minority or awareness of a service, right? This is how you can do it. And you can do it now in real time in rural areas where we're normally getting any information once a year. So you can see, this is in Acholi, people talking about problems with infrastructure, the roads being washed away. We have a number of...
And this bars women from participation. There is also violence by us, the public. Many people think those women who are in political leadership, they are either bad wives, they are prostitutes, they have been called names. Nobody believes that you can actually get into an election, win, and effectively participate.
Clinic chứ vào nơi để đặt trở quên nó cái clinic mà cái nó tuê đấy của mấy đây cái cái mẹ đấy nói gì cũng chỉ lúc clinic các đặt ra thì area pagamento meu tu ver clinic que mo aqui mà cái cái này về pertie béo chắc thì cũng về area ya đôi qua rồi cái kia ya thì yo con abia les no tengo ni di diermo an monta min ma mi ya te coen ori diermo we di porta dok ma dai com you Ambara mire que yera marina no mama po kwaro iko te guyo ka mo ka mo ku we ti po kwaro ka mo ka ro je ko we ti po kwaro ko i kwaro we a de a pi ni dip no.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going around these days. So, but it's interesting. You know, those are all conversations that were spotted in Uganda right now. We have been working to understand and map hate speech against refugees. You can see coming into the country from South Sudan, and people saying things like they're carrying diseases in the country. We can see reports, people saying that there are elephants being driven out by the fighting in South Sudan, and that they are destroying crops in northern Uganda, and people are saying if they don't stop, we're going to have to shoot the elephants. So this is stuff that you wouldn't catch easily without this kind of approach. A couple more examples. We just partnered recently with BBVA Bank. They're the largest financial institution in Latin America, based in Spain. And we looked at the impact of a hurricane on Baja California State in 2014. The question was, can we use that financial data, that map of Spain that you saw, right, to understand resilience? Can we see differences in how populations are impacted and how quickly they're able to recover? What you can see here is that we worked with their analysts essentially to create a counterfactual baseline. That's this top white line, the expected spending based on neighboring areas and previous historical behavior of this population in terms of airtime, in terms of ATM transactions, ATM withdrawals and debit card transactions. So that's what we would expect spending to be. But you see there's this drop. The yellow bar is the moment the storm hits, right? And then you see this pattern of recovery. What's interesting is that the pattern of recovery varies tremendously depending on where you were relative to where the eye made landfall. But it's not only related to the wind speed, right? Because there are also differences in income. There are differences in quality of education, disaster preparedness, healthcare system, transportation. Our hope is to be able to understand over time through this type of analysis what types of policy interventions are most effective at increasing the propensity of a community to rebound after an exogenous shock. Here we are again in Mexico. This is looking at a project we did with WFP. The idea here was to look at population mobility after disaster. This was floods in the state of Tabasco. That's where the pepper comes from. And you can see on a normal night, there's some movement, but this was the night of the floods over on the right. The goal here wasn't to really understand where people were being displaced from, so much as to develop the capability to automatically detect sinks where people were flowing into. Because if you could actually tell where people who were displaced were gathering and needed assistance automatically, you could actually get trucks on the road faster. And if you were to say overlay that information on Google Earth and say plot a course from here to there, and say that's 9 hours, you could then use predictive analytics to say, well, at the rate of inflow, we expect there to be 2,000 people by the time the trucks arrive, so we need this many in the convoy. That's the idea. Predictive humanitarian logistics application. Another way to measure poverty is by looking at roofs. So in the Ugandan 2012 census, roofing material was a poverty indicator, socioeconomic indicator, and if you had corrugated aluminum roofs, that was indicates you have more money. We know how much that stuff costs per square meter, so we trained an algorithm to do just that. About a year and a half ago, we partnered with the Universal Postal Union, member of the UN family. They have a system they stood up in 2010 that essentially tracks every package or letter sent through the national postal systems of 198 countries across international borders. It's not domestic, it's international traffic. About 14 million records a day. We have all of it for 6 years and the real-time stream. We had a network scientist from Cambridge University this past summer in our lab, and it turns out we can get pretty good estimates of things like GDP, carbon footprint, consumer price index, poverty rates from this type of information. It's a good proxy for trade. The flows correlate about 85% with eBay's public sales figures. So not a lot of love letters out there, lots of e-commerce. Goes through this flow system. You can see the type of data the system produces for countries like Chad, right, which don't produce a lot of digital data, yet the postal system actually is running the system. And you can actually see variation in that data set. You can see all sorts of things when you start to map the trade relations by proxy with different countries. Who knew that Switzerland's second largest trading partner, or third largest, was Brazil? Very curious. So, this isn't all easy. How representative is the data? Lots of problems here. Not everybody is on Twitter. These people tend to be urban, they tend to be young, they tend to have enough money to have a smartphone, they're digitally literate, they're literate at all. And the reason that looks like a roadmap is because the sensors aren't evenly distributed. It's not like anything, it's like you say, well, there's nothing interesting happening in the dark spaces. No, it's just that there's nobody tweeting there, right? So these are, this isn't about sort of, oh, we can take, we can use this new data and just replace our surveys. Not a chance. Not in this, at least not in the case of something like social media. One of the things that we're going to be doing in the years to come is as we work with these data sets, mapping their representativeness so that you can understand where they can be used for one purpose or another. If you are trying to measure food prices, like you saw our example from Twitter, you need lots of tweets every day to get a reliable estimate of food prices. If you're trying to measure an indicator. If you're trying to understand, is it going up or going down, and you don't really need to know by how much exactly, the representativeness matters a bit less. How many tweets do you need from, say, Mali today saying, I think my sister has Ebola? You need one to be able to justify investigating that, right? So it depends what the purpose is. There you're trying to detect an event. So there are different kinds of applications for this. But from an evaluation standpoint, the representativeness is the first thing you have to understand. What's the denominator? Virtually every project that we do, the first thing we're doing is going out there and getting really good survey data and ground truthing this stuff so that we can build a model and understand the robustness of that model and where it's applicable geographically and demographically. Data access, as I said, companies don't just give this stuff away, they hold on to it for dear life. They have many reasons not to share. Companies today still don't see much risk in not sharing this data. Part of our mission is to change that. We're trying to get to a world in which they actually see more risk in not sharing the data than sharing. Data science is a new field. This is a field that combines many, many different disciplines. Now there are actually academic programs in data science, but they're just a couple of years old. The data scientists that are out there practicing professionally, working with these large data sets, they came from particle physics, the neurosciences, a number of different fields where they were able to apply things like statistical mechanics to work with large networks of data. But these people are expensive. I mean, I used to work at Microsoft. Microsoft a couple of years ago hired a data scientist with an unheard of 7 years of experience. He was 29. And his starting salary was $600,000, including stock. So there are not enough data scientists out there, and this is part of the challenge. We're going to have to cultivate these skills in-house. You can't outsource this stuff. We have about day this is going to become as normal to how we operate as basic statistics is today. And then there's the fact that the data sets are really large. So we have a partnership with Twitter, for example, that actually gives the entire UN system through this partnership access to 500 million messages a day. That's something like 4 gigabytes per second coming out of Twitter. So won't fit in your spreadsheet, lots of computing. We work with cloud computing technologies. We work with Amazon's computing grid. Amazon is the state of the art out there. We can take a data set of 200 million tweets and put it out on 100 servers and crunch through it looking for symptoms related to health or education in a matter of minutes. But you have to have that technological skill. So, as I mentioned, we've been engaging with companies for some time around this concept of data philanthropy since 2011, and the response from the beginning was quite overwhelming. Lots of interest from companies, but looking at how do we do this, and what data are we sharing, and how do we protect privacy, and how do we protect our own competitiveness in the marketplace, and so forth. It's really taken off now. This has become a global movement. There are, MasterCard just hired a data philanthropy manager, right? We were talking about this 6 years ago. Now it's a thing, and they're subject to conferences and articles. So these are some of the partnerships that we have. You can see for data access, Twitter, UDU, BBVA, Telefonica has can give us anonymized call records from 18 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, Korea Telecom, Airtel across Africa, and much of the Pacific, and also companies giving us access to their technologies. We're now starting to apply a more leveraged approach to this, so we're getting ready to launch our Data for Climate Action Challenge. We have 13 companies who have pledged to make access to data and technology available to research teams around the world who will compete to develop solutions for climate change. You can see these are some of the companies that are involved: Google Waze, Person Hexagon, Nielsen, Planet Labs, Satellite Imagery, and so forth. Privacy. So, as you've probably seen, if you've been reading these articles recently about this company, Cambridge Analytica, Trump they can predict just by what you like on Facebook, what your IQ is, what your religion is, and how religious you are, your sexual orientation, your political affiliation, many things, whether or not you drink alcohol. It's incredibly difficult to anonymize this data. Even if you take just how people move through a city, and you take out the name, the phone number, and the address of that person, but you still have location. Right? How many people spend the holidays where you do, are in where you are every night at 4 o'clock in the morning, and are where you are 5 days a week during work hours? Everybody can be unique in that data set. Right? So, but if you aggregate the stuff to the point that there's no privacy risk, of course, then it's not very useful. And this is the challenge. I showed you the example of using population movement information for public health. So imagine we're in Uganda again, and we know down to the square meter where people are. Well, if there's a disease outbreak, you can say the risk of Ebola is right here, that's where we need to quarantine. But what if we want to blur it a little bit to protect privacy? See, then it gets a little large, and by the time you're starting to impinge on a secondary road, we have no idea what a quarantine will have in effect. Right? There's a relationship between privacy and utility. And the challenge here is that our privacy regulations today basically say protect privacy at all costs, and then if there's any utility afterward, have at it. We see privacy as one source of risk, but there's an even greater risk that also has to be addressed from non-use. It's not just misuse. How many children will die of malaria in Uganda this year? Because we're not using data to help the public health system stay ahead of the curve on that deadly disease. Many, many, many. Those are preventable harms. So one can think of this, one can think of the non-use of this data as also a failure of responsibility. We have this set of data privacy principles that we follow in every project we would do with any of you. These would be applied to make sure that we're mitigating the risks to the greatest degree possible, while still ensuring that we can do the work, and you have to be able to justify it. We recently released, I have a copy of this. This is our new report. It's a guide on data innovation for development. This is how you can do a project like this yourself. Distilling everything we've learned over the last 7 years. And here is our report, which I hope you had a chance to look at on integrating big data into non-technical evaluation. So this really lays out the case for how this can work. You know, where is there a role for big data, for example, in generating the counterfactual? What's the role of theory? This is something that's been much discussed. And we really we did this in partnership with Rockefeller Foundation. It ended up taking about 3 years to get to where we wanted to. The report is meant to inform in a very practical way, but also to serve as a call to action, to say it's time. And we're already now seeing lots of donors interested in funding experiments in this area, saying, work with Global Pulse and others to figure out how to use these new data sources. So if you're interested in working with us on evaluation projects, there are data scientists who want to get involved. There are donors who want to fund the projects. This is something that is finally gathering a lot of momentum. Just to wrap up, we're moving toward a world, let's say by 2030, in which maybe half the population of the planet will be wearing a device that's free. If you wear it, it tracks everywhere you go, everything you buy and sell, everything you say, everything you do, everything you feel, everything you think, and the functioning of every organ in your body. Transparent society. Is that the enlightened information society or the stuff of dystopian nightmares? Yes, but it depends. What we're coming to understand, and others are coming to understand, is that the UN, with its mandates around development and human rights simultaneously, is the only organization in the world that can play the role of figuring out a way forward here for the global community. We have to make sure that there are some kinds of information that are guaranteed always to be used for good when they can be. Some kinds of information that can never be accessed by anyone, and maybe some that can only be used by machines. We'll have to see. But it'd be very interesting crossroads as we set out to measure the SDGs and implement them. One day, maybe understanding what's happening in health or livelihoods or education will be as easy as understanding temperature, wind speed, and air pressure. We're not there yet. About the ingredients of it. That was a lot of one-way information, so I'll stop.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe let me kick off for, I want to open space for our colleagues to reflect too. Certainly very interesting to listen to Robert. As always, I'm very happy to have been part of the OIOS at the time when we first engaged with Robert. Recently we met in Cape Town at the World, first UN World Data Forum. And I realized very strongly that this is upon us. It is coming our way, and it's for us to find ways of making use of it. At the moment, I can't kind of avoid the sense that it is data looking for questions. The issue for us is, do these data sets, these data streams, do they correspond to being helpful to responding to the answers to the questions we have? Can they be related to the causal questions that we grapple with? For us in UNDP in particular, but I think often for speaking for the UN system as a whole, in a way, there are only a few of the co-leads of the UN who are directly engaged in the disaster response or the emergency. You can see how information travels in the emergency settings. But for those of us who are dealing with institutional and policy development processes and with tiny amounts of money, it's kind of far-fetched still to draw any causal link between what happens on that front and the Twitter feeds. But I think the challenge is upon us then to think through, and maybe it comes back to program design and an advocacy role that we might have by way of making our programmatic colleagues to think through as they set new priorities and programs. Will they embed in their monitoring and evaluation frameworks an awareness of what data streams might be useful to keep tabs of? I'm not going to say more than that. I'd like to have it before we back. I suggested we keep to quarter two because of now starting we have to run. But I'd like to understand a bit better on the privacy side. With the data philanthropy, I can't avoid the sense of still being some questions about can we actually yet trust the proprietary veracity of these data sets. Are we sure that you can't, someone is going to be coming to your web, there's something else going on here that will be useful in other surveillance and that things that sort of undermine our fundamental premise of the privacy being available to us. I suggest maybe we could ask some other colleagues and then you rather than through the or colleagues online, Jim, if you have. Okay, I see here. So I'm just direct for now and then we'll.
Sure, thank you. Thanks very much. Very, very interesting. I have a question on data access. And I fully understand the data access issues related to corporations and their proprietary data. But I'm curious about to hear your thoughts on data access issues in working with academics and universities. I know there's some issues there. I know some universities, for example, if they enter into partnership, have to own the data. Or some scholars have incentives to hold on to the really good data so they can publish on it later and not necessarily use it for real-time programming response. I'm curious to hear if you've had any experiences like that, or if you think it's a legitimate issue.
Sure. And then we had two more at the back, and then we'll go back to Robert. Yes, please.
Nico Ross from OCHA. Have you already worked on any projects for evaluations, or where you use big data for evaluations in the sense of, did this program or this intervention, did this work? And especially with regard to involving the views of, the affected people.
We'll take one more. Thank you for introducing yourself. I should have to you. I'm Mario Howard, Deputy Director of the Independent Development.
I'm Vijaya from the Independent Evaluation Office at UNDP. I must say that in our office we used big data in the evaluation. So we did protective data evaluation, we used NASA data. And also when we did the Human Development Report evaluations, we used it's a different kind of big data. The web data, how products are used on the web, and looking at who downloaded it and what content was used. Having said that, I would like to, Ariel asked about how do we use it, evaluations, but a little bit if you can talk about what are the boundaries of big data. Because some of the, one of the clips which you showed, slides is stuck in my head, you showed a snapshot and a traffic, a video of a traffic moving. But I think in development, everything cannot be going on minute by minute. You need to have some theorizing and projections made and have a work plan to take development forward. So it can't be like every minute the Twitter feed kind of a thing cannot keep changing, cannot change the development plans. Exactly. So how do you look at the Twitter data in that sense? And also I'm a bit concerned about these spurious correlations done with Twitter, and then saying that because much of that we can tell with the existing traditional data, how people are moving, where diseases can be concentrated. If the traffic is heavy, then there can be, the prostitution can be there on where it's happening. All this we don't have to really depend on. It can be told. So how do you look at these correlations?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Coming at you.
Sure, yeah, no, absolutely. So, on the issue of privacy, so when we partner with a company, we work with them as part of the agreement to define how the data will be transformed by that data controller, by them, prior to our receiving access to it. Secondly, and that has to be in, compliance with national laws and so forth, and also in compliance with our own principles in terms of what we will and will not handle. There are a number of models that are emerging. So sometimes we actually get a copy of a data set. Other times we get VPN access. We can log into a machine inside that company and get access to a data set. There are other cases where we can't get direct access. We can execute a query on the data set and get the results back. There are other cases where their team actually does the queries on the data set. When we look at sort of how this is going to scale over the next 10 years, I think you're going to see many different models. Some where the data is shared and some where it's kept, and others where companies are actually even selling to national statistics offices, estimates for employment and poverty and so forth. Lots of different patterns are emerging. But auditability is going to be critical here because one can imagine cases where a company would actually have an incentive to manipulate information themselves. So that's something that we're already in discussions with. I was just having this conversation with Facebook, the World Data Forum. So they said we don't have a data for good strategy. I said it's great, you can be audited. They said what? I said, well, if you want it to be used as legally legitimate information for public policy, you're going to have to be subject to that. So that's an issue. But I'll say public perceptions around privacy matter a great deal. If you say, wow, you go on Amazon, and so people who bought this book also bought that book. That's great, right? Because you see the benefit of that. It's aggregated behavioral information that you think twice about it, right? What people search for on Google when they search for fever and a headache, that is actually reasonably robust after a little bit of tweaking for predicting flu outbreaks. People think that's great. They don't think it's creepy, right? Facebook can tell with 70% certainty that you're going to break up with your girlfriend next Tuesday. Whoa, okay, that's not okay. That's really creepy. Because I don't see the benefit of Facebook knowing that, right? So again, anytime we work on one of these projects, we go through a risk management assessment that looks at, what are the risks across the SDGs of a privacy breach? What's the likelihood of it? What are the possible harms? And what are the risks to health, to education, to livelihood if we don't do this project? Right? So you have to really think about that in a balanced way and be prepared to communicate quite transparently what you're doing with the data. I think in terms of academic access, this question, what do we see with academics? I mean, look, governments have their reasons not to share data, right? Academics have their reasons not to share data. NGOs have their reasons not to share data. It's very simple. Information is power. Right? Why would I want to give it to the competition? Right? Academics want to hold on to it long enough to be able to publish. Governments will say it's a national security issue. The NGOs don't want to share it because then the other NGOs they're competing with for limited funds from donors will be easier to access by their competition. What's interesting about big data, and we see this in sort of country team dynamics in Uganda and Indonesia and elsewhere, this isn't data that you designed and collected according to your mandate. This is data that is how people move, how they spend, how they communicate publicly. That isn't about health. It isn't about education. It's not your turf. It's external. It's owned by private sector. And we see this really kind of creatively disruptive dynamic where multiple agencies will actually come together to figure out how to use one of these new kinds of data because it's not internal to their organization. So I think that's a very positive dynamic. In terms of the IP issues, when we partner with these companies, there are different ways the UN can handle IP and academics, the same thing. We have university partnerships. We tend to want inventors to own their own IP, but we want to make sure that all the innovations that come out of this are made available as public goods. And that seems to be the strategy we insist on with legal affairs. Have we done evaluations already? That was a question. I mean, sort of. We have, and again, they fall into the general category of what we did a few years ago with OIOS, looking at online communications. And this is, I mean, a great place to start. If you have programs that you're looking at evaluating that have an advocacy component, I mean, that's where this technology came from. companies wanting to understand the effectiveness of their advertising, right? Repurposing that to understand whether you were changing perceptions, changing awareness. It works quite well for that. Again, you have to understand who's in that data set, who's on Facebook, who's on social media. But Uganda is a great place to pilot this stuff because we can also get the radio content, right? And that's where we can start to really be able to reach out into these rural areas as well. But I would, if you have programs where Twitter and Facebook are being actively used for awareness, that's the sort of thing you can do today, and we'd be glad to help you do that. As I say, we have a partnership with Twitter that grants any part of the UN system through us access to all of that data. And we now have a UN Twitter users group that we chair with OICT. So if you're interested, write me, you can join the group and propose a project and see what we can do to get started. Boundaries of big data. Yeah, lots of boundaries, lots of hype. There's lots of fear and there's lots of hype, and the people hyping and the people afraid never talk to each other in the same room. Time scales. So we talk about real time all the time, right? But I mean, when we think about real time for us means still a current enough reflection of reality that you can use it to change an outcome. So if we're talking about a disaster context, that's measured in hours. If we're talking about a disease outbreak, it's a matter of days, right? If you're talking about food security, it's weeks. If you're talking about malnutrition, it's months, right? So how up to date does the information need to be? One of the challenges all of our institutions are facing is what kinds of decisions can we make with that involve these new sources of data versus the traditional sources of data. Mayor Bloomberg in New York some years ago talked about how he hated Twitter because it turned every pothole in the city into a public referendum. Right? How actionable is that? There's a pothole on 59th. Okay. We have a lot of other things going on. Should we drop everything we're doing and respond to that? No. I think the challenge here is that we have to figure out what kinds of decisions can be made with these data sets. I'll just say one example from emergency management. We had I was talking to the head of FEMA, emergency response in the U.S., who said, when they had 1,600 tornadoes back in 2010, and they started monitoring Twitter for the first time. All they could tell was that about 40 different towns were mentioned. They had no idea the extent of the damage, how many people were affected, any of it. And Craig Fugate got all of his team together and said, okay, we're going to get trucks to all 40 of these locations immediately. They said, Administrator, with all due respect, you're crazy. That's inefficient. We'll wait till the satellite comes over, we'll take a very good image of it, we'll know exactly how much damage there is, and then we won't have to worry about half the stuff rotting on trucks and having to ship it back at our cost. And we said, no, you don't understand. This isn't about making widgets. We're not trying to optimize it for efficiency. We're trying to find a way to change an outcome by leveraging the speed, even at the cost of accuracy. There are some people who will not be able to be helped 36 hours from now. So there's some kinds of outcomes we can only change by looking at the speed. And when you start to think that way, that creates a different kind of conversation inside the organization. But the boundaries are there, and just to be clear, people change how they use digital services, and therefore they change the utility of the data over time, and it varies culturally, right? We found ways to predict X and Y in Indonesia from looking at Twitter, but if we go back before 2012, it doesn't work, because it was only during the elections that people started to talk about household needs on social media. So it's an evolving landscape. You never sort of settle on methodology and say, okay, that is now reliable. You have to recheck your models and recheck your models. So.
Online questions.
Great. Let's see.
Since the audio is close to you, Robert.
Yeah. Let's see.
We only have a couple of minutes.
Okay. Very quickly. Yeah. Question: do you have plans to train people at the UN at the various locations to become data scientists through workshops, seminars, and online learning? We don't have that planned. I will say that we have a lot of secondments who work on our team, and that's a great way to get hands-on experience with this. But there are organizations, one that we MIT and Harvard and ODI, they're starting to offer training in data science for development. We're partnering with them going forward. So there are online programs in data science, but again, Datapop is actually looking at a development-specific one. Question about collecting data in-house. Having worked in evaluation for some years, one of the main challenges encountered was the fact that information in different regional and country offices is not integrated. Are there plans to start integrating better the information collected from different country offices? If there are, I'm not aware of it. Our focus is on the data that's outside of the institution in the first place. So that is a separate challenge. What I have seen is that you can't learn whether big data can be useful unless you can test it against robust survey data. So we see this dynamic in country teams where we say, we have to figure out whether we can use this, and suddenly people say, well, we have some data. Nobody knew they had that data. So that's interesting, but interoperability is a hard one. From Susanna Morrison, we have, if you can comment on what the main obstacles are for putting big data to use in evaluations. How can development actors identify data scientists that will be willing to participate in data philanthropy by providing services for evaluations? The main challenges are sort of, the first challenge is simply understanding how to think about this stuff in terms of how it can be useful for evaluation. Yes, is it a nail running around looking for a hammer? Sometimes. On the other hand, Henry Ford once said, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. What we find is most useful with partners in the UN in general is to work together, where we know what can be done with big data, you know what you're doing. It's a lot of brainstorming. It takes about 3 meetings before we really say, okay, this is what we're going to work on first, but we can get there. Access is a challenge. We can help you with that. Data science, we can help you with that. There are costs associated with it, but to get started, there's not very much because we get the data and the technology most of the time for free from these companies. If you want to operationalize this stuff around the world, you'll have to pay for it, but by then you'll know what the return on investment is, and you'll be able to justify it in your budgets. So there are some challenges, but